Alright, tonight we're going to be talking about powers of I. You know the deal. First, you got to try some stuff. So try 1 and 2, put me on pause, and check your answers when you come back. Alright, so we have the square root of 9, which we all know equals 3. But let's say we wanted to know what the square root of negative 9 is. So when we ask someone to take the square root of something, it's the number times itself. You know what I mean? So square root of 9 is 3 times 3. But in order to get the square root of negative 9, we'd need 3 times negative 3. And that's not the same number. 3 is not the same number as negative 3. So what we do is we call the square root of negative 9, it has no real roots. Alright, so we have the square root. Let's look at number 2. Square root of 36, we all know is 6. And the square root of negative 36, it has no real roots. Alright, so this is where imaginary numbers come in. So if we asked you to take the square root of negative 1, this is what we call an imaginary unit called, what do you think it's called? It's called I. You guessed it. So if we ask you what the square root of negative 1 is, it equals I. Alright, so let's take a look at some examples. So we have negative, the square root of negative 1. So carry down that negative. So we have negative, and we just learned that the square root of negative 1 is I. So negative square root of negative 1 is negative I. We look at number 2, the square root of negative 11. So you can rewrite this as the square root of negative 1 and the square root of 11. And we know the square root of negative 1 is I, and we can't do anything with the square root of negative 11, so you get I square root negative 11, or I radical 11. Now if we're looking at number 3, we have negative 49 underneath the radical. So this negative is going to act as your I, so bring that down, and then we're just taking the square root of 49, which is 7. Always put the number in front. Treat I as a variable like x or y, so it's 7i, not I7, okay? And now, if we look at example number 4, we have negative 3, so we can bring that down. And remember, we just said that negative becomes I, and then the square root of 16 is 4, so you have negative 3 times 4i, which equals negative 12i. Alright, so simplifying works the same way. So we have the negative under the radicals, so we're automatically going to write I. Then we're taking, you have radical 9 times radical 2, which would be radical 18. And we know that the square root of 9 is, square root of 9 is 3. Sorry about that. So we have 3i radical 2. Alright, so now we're looking at example 2. Simplify this one. We have our negative under the radical, and we have 4 on the outside, so let's bring that out. 4i times, we have radical 25 radical 2. You get 4i times 5 times radical 2, and we end up with 20i radical 2. Alright, let's look at the powers of I. I to the 0, we know anything to the 0 power is 1. That's just by laws of exponents. Anything to the 0 power is always 1. I to the first, well, we know anything to the first power is always itself, so I to the first is I. I squared. So I squared. So just remember, the square root of -1 equals I. So if I square both sides, I get -1 equals I squared. So I squared equals -1. I cubed is I squared times I, which equals, we just found out, -1 times I, and that equals -I. So I to the fourth is I squared times I squared, so -1 times -1, and that's +1. So if you want to see that, it's I squared times I squared, and we know I squared right here is -1, so -1 times -1 is 1. I to the fifth is I to the fourth. Whoops. My goodness. Times I. So I to the fourth we just found out was 1 times I. So I to the fifth is I. I to the sixth is I to the fifth times I. So I to the fifth was I times I, which is I squared. And we know I squared is -1. I to the seventh is I to the sixth times I, and we know I to the sixth is -1, so -1 times I is -I. So do we notice a pattern here? So our first one is I to the 0 is 1, then you have I to the first is I, then you have I squared is -1, then I cubed is -I, and then I to the fourth is 1, I, 1, -I. So this goes in kind of stages of 4, groups of 4, so the pattern is 1, I, -1, -I, 1, I, -1, -I. So if I was to do I to the 8th, it would be 1, I to the 9th, I to the 10th, -1, I to the 11th, and that equals -I. And you can just keep going, but eventually we want to find an easier way to do this, so when you flip it over on the back, I'll tell you how. Alright, so if you look down at our example, it says I to the 82nd power. Do you really want to go through all those, go by 4 and go 1, I, -1, -I, 1, I, all the way through? No. So what we're going to do is you're going to plug in your calculator. So our first step, you're going to hit the math key, your favorite subject, go over to num or number, select number 3, which says I part. You're going to type in your I key, and that's second decimal. When you have your I, you're going to do to the whatever power it is. So that's where your calculator is going to help you. So let's all do that now. Go to I to the 82nd, click math, num, scroll to number 3, which is I part, hit second, the decimal button, and I will pop up, and then do your caret to the 82nd power, and we get I to the 82nd is -1. Alright, let's do the same thing for I to the 99. So we have math, it's a number 3, I part, put in I, which is second decimal, put your little caret, plug in the number, and I to the 99 equals negative I. Alright, keep it going. Try this one by yourself, I to the 300. So remember, we're doing math to num to I part, number 3, I, second decimal key, caret, and your number, and you get that equals 1. We have I to the 2000. Do that one. Math, number 3, I part, I, second decimal, I, caret, 2000. You get 1. Now let's say I wanted you to find I to the 2001. Well, you can plug that in your calculator, or we know what comes after 1 in our sequence, and it's I. So if you ever get back-to-back numbers like that, it would be kind of cool to just remember your pattern. Alright, but let's say they give you a problem like this. 2i squared times 3i to the third. So you're going to start with 2, and you're going to multiply that by, you're going to do your math, number 3, I part, type in I squared, which your I key is second plus decimal. You get all that, and it equals negative 1, times, we have 3 times math, number 3, I part, type in I, second decimal, caret key, number to the third power, and that comes out to be negative I. So we have negative 2 times negative 3i, which equals 6i, because a negative times a negative is positive. Alright, so now we have 3i cubed squared, and you can just rewrite it like this: 3 squared times I cubed squared. You get 3 squared is 9. I cube raised to the second power. We multiply our exponents, so we get I to the 6th. And when you put this in your calculator, you do 9 times your math, number 3, which is I part, type in your I, which is second plus decimal, caret key to the 6th power, and you get, it equals negative 1, so you get negative 9 times negative 1, 9 times negative 1, which equals negative 9. Alright, hope you enjoyed this cool imaginary unit. See you tomorrow in class for some more practice.